So at the MREA, as an organization, we were started in response to the first Gulf War. And the context there was to promote, advocate, build a domestic clean energy economy to reduce our dependence on foreign oil and stop this endless war for oil that has kind of driven our global geopolitics. And I think today, our mission, incredibly, is probably more important than ever, as we see much of the destabilization in Europe and the Middle East is ostensibly about energy. And so in that context, I want to ask you all, in your work, what are you doing and what do you think the priorities are if we're looking at this global context? Two questions. First, global inequity. Let's use that as a frame. How are in the ways that you're working, how are we reducing our reliance on fossil fuel? What are you doing? Is that a priority for you? And what can we do domestically to make sure that as we build renewables and as we electrify, that maintains a priority of us to kind of decouple us from this global energy market in some way? And what are the potential challenges with that? And thoughts on the equity conversation with decoupling ourselves from this global petroleum market?
Nick, that's a really big question, and it's something that I thought about when I prepped for what's my kind of vision, what would I be surprised about in 2033. When we look at the electric vehicle battery industry, almost none of the critical minerals are mined or processed in the United States that go into batteries, whether they eventually end up in an electric vehicle or a stationary storage system. The CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, three big federal laws, set aside a bunch of money for manufacturing and production tax credits to help onshore these industries and the clean energy industry into the United States. And so that's a big start that we have right now to bring those supply chains home to help decouple us from not only the gasoline industry, but other critical industries for national security, and that will help us reach our clean energy goals. I think it's still fraught, and we have a lot of work left to be done. One of the other podcasts this season was about critical minerals and all of the conservation and environmental harms that mining can do. And so I think, as we look to onshore these industries, we also have to work with local communities and make sure that we're doing it in really thoughtful, strategic ways to meet all of the environmental goals that I think we're all here to talk about. And then I think there's kind of this broader question too around as we transition toward clean energy, a lot of us are doing that for environmental benefits, right? But it also means that we can grow our energy here in the Midwest. We have tons of farms, we have lots of land, we can build solar and wind farms, that can power our buildings, power our vehicles. And so I think part of that question is inherent in the transition, and then the other part is really complicated, right? How do we make sure that we can truly build all of these materials in our communities?
Like, if we just trade this kind of oligarchy, this global oligarchy that is oligarchy, for kind of a global monopoly on critical minerals, then we'll be in the same situation in some ways, just with a different resource. And so I really appreciate that context, and I see that equity context. Can we build things in this country? Like, I've noticed it started really with this kind of left and right populist movement in response to kind of the offshoring, this like 25 years of shopping at Walmart and now hating China, this whole symptom we have. And now we're seeing real policies, like you mentioned, that like re-stimulate onshoring. And so I think that's we're going to get to that question of what does that look like to really satisfy our energy needs domestically through manufacturing and mining, et cetera.
So an example to kind of bring that home, Michigan has won 4 large battery manufacturing facilities over the past year or so. And so over the next few years, we're going to see these very large, very energy-intensive facilities come online. And one of them is tied to a Chinese battery manufacturer, Gotion. And so as that facility was being approved, both at the local level and at the state level, to receive state incentives to bring those jobs into Michigan communities, there's a very large conversation around Yes, we want those jobs in Michigan. Yes, we want to be building batteries in the United States. But what does that mean when the technology is tied to a Chinese company, right? Is that something that we want to be investing our money in? Do we really have ownership over that? And so I think, again, it's that push and pull between how much can we both build the actual technology here, but also own the technology, right? Be the innovators, be the ones coming up with these new battery chemistries. And so I think there's a little bit of all of it. It's the critical mineral supply chain, but it's also the knowledge economy and having the right research and development so that we can not only be building the thing, but also inventing the thing here.
I guess I'll go back to your earlier question about sort of global equity and democratization of energy. And I think, I'll give the parochial answer for me on the nuclear energy side. There are challenges with the way that we export nuclear technology and enabling other countries to adopt nuclear if they wanted to have a cleaner energy mix for them. On the other hand, I think one of the other big global questions is the path dependence of growing your economy and moving to a clean energy economy ultimately. For a long time, there's been this question of the fact that our Western and developed economies have enabled our growth and able to get to this place where we can invest in renewable energies through this fossil fuel pathway. And if we deny that to other countries, then it could become a burden for them to sort of leapfrog that. And so trying to understand the kind of technologies that we can assist other countries with skipping over fossil fuels, but then also understanding where there may be a need for them to move through that pathway also, at least temporarily, on the way to a richer economy that can afford the more expensive energy technologies, assuming they continue to be more expensive.
Yeah, with regards to clean energy access, economic development, and local jobs to support the clean energy transition, in our study we had a separate economics modeling firm look at the state of Wisconsin at by 2050, once the clean energy transition happens, and essentially they showed we already have manufacturing base in Milwaukee area and consulting and services and research and development in the Madison area and metalworks and machining and stuff throughout Wisconsin, and we can leverage those bases to have EV component, battery component assembly. Different technologies made in the state of Wisconsin, all the services to provide the construction and installation of these resources done here. But a lot of the markets we're looking at is kind of a chicken and egg scenario where the demand's not quite there, and so the supply is not going to be there just yet unless we have a vision, unless we have public-private partnerships to support market formation, to give a clear vision for businesses to create their manufacturing hubs in certain areas to create jobs. And if we don't have that unified vision together, those jobs may end up elsewhere. But if we can have that statewide vision, the governor's office, the legislature, and have these public-private partnerships, we can ensure that there's going to be robust economic development in not only Wisconsin, but local areas where we live, and have jobs in the future by 2050. Otherwise, we're going to miss the boat on that.
Just to follow up and maybe a question, but I think also, in addition to having that vision, one thing that we sort of don't talk about enough is we need the persistence of that vision over time. Right? These transitions are going to have durations where when we have policy fluctuations, more so than being the wrong policy, that the volatility in the policy can really be damaging. So you have thoughts on how do we achieve a persistence, consistency of that vision towards a clean energy future, rather than relying on the current leaders having that vision and then 5 years from now it all erodes?
Yeah, exactly. We have to look at our political reality in the state of Wisconsin. We have Republicans and Democrats, and right now in the legislature, Republicans have control of that. And so we've got to have a vision that gives everyone access to that future. And if we're talking about climate change here, maybe that's not the dialogue we're having with other parties that are interested in economic development. And they realize that they want to help businesses transition if that future is happening. So it's essentially changing the dialogue if we're talking with different parties to sustain that. And if we're going to unify over economic development, then that's going to be a place where we can come together and support businesses that will create the jobs of the future. So I think just acknowledging the reality that we're going to have a diverse base Wisconsinites in political reality here and bring everybody in that future to make it happen decade over decade.
Yeah, I think one of the frustrations over time has been how energy sources are now viewed to be certain energy sources are now viewed to be partisan. You know, CUB is a nonpartisan organization, but I remember there were, 15, 20 years ago, it wasn't partisan in terms of which kind of fuel you supported. It was both standard bearers for the presidential nomination at one point supported carbon caps. It's dramatic how different that's changed, how much that's changed. When there's an electron, the electron doesn't care if it's red or blue. There is no red and blue when it comes to electricity. So that's a frustration. But I think it's interesting how this transition is happening and attempting to happen in the midst of the polarization and the politicization.
Yeah, so we're creeping into the national conversation, which is where I really wanted to go. And I think, to Paul's point, and I think the framing of our whole podcast season has been that with the passage of the CHIPS Act and bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act, federally, we are set to spend more money on energy infrastructure in the next decade than the previous 30, and ostensibly, there's policy certainty for 10 years, though we've already seen efforts to kind of roll back some of the provisions there unsuccessfully. To kind of draw a line from global to domestic, and one of the problems that I see, and to boot up this next part of the conversation, it seems to me domestically, and we've talked about this with Marquita and all of you, really, is that the inequity in our system, and I can draw a through line from this idea of redlining and creating wealthy areas intentionally and creating non-wealthy areas intentionally. And that's where we put our energy infrastructure and those problems today that include high health impacts on employment. And then it seems to me in this kind of still in this not in my backyard mindset, then we took that approach and we exported our dirty manufacturing. We exported our dirty exploration on other countries. And now we're in this situation where we need to build, and Andrew, you addressed this, and so did Chelsea in our conversations, a tremendous amount of renewables in everybody's backyards. And nobody wants them. I shouldn't say that. Lots of people want them because they understand the revenue that it develops for the local jurisdictions. They understand the long-term leases, the non-farm-based supporting revenue that supports farms, all of these things. But there is this strong sense of resistance in some sectors, to your point, Tom, and I think there's some politics there. And at the same time, as this legislation, state and federal legislation, focuses on targeting those jurisdictions that we historically harmed, there's resistance there also. There's problems, there's challenges there. So I kind of really want to build off this social question, because I feel like that's really important. What you said, it's not a technological problem, it's a social problem. And ask you, in your work as you're engaging people, what are you doing to solve the social problem that I see as a national problem that we've had for maybe over 100 years? This idea of we want all the benefits and none of the consequences, and we'll let other people suffer the consequences. Is it a little too heavy for this early in the morning?
So I think one part of, how we can make sure that, address concerns that communities have when they're looking at, the prospect of a lot of renewables in their community is to make sure that we're trying to maximize the use of distributed small-scale solar and wind. So think things like solar on people's homes or buildings, using brownfields, previously developed areas that aren't going to be used for agriculture. Really maximizing deployment on those areas because I think it faces a lot less resistance from folks usually, and it's just a lot more favorable for a lot of people. And it also puts these projects in people's communities so they can see it, the impact that it's having, and it's sometimes that does cause issues, but I think that's one way to do it. Another way, and I can't remember who, maybe it was Chelsea, but the ownership question, making sure that these projects are, that communities have control, ownership over these projects, that they're actually getting access to the benefits. It's not just benefiting a large company, a corporate investor, but that communities where these projects are sited are actually really receiving the benefits and have control and decision-making power over them. I think that can go a lot of way towards just addressing concerns and increasing public support for wide, large-scale renewable deployment.
I'll jump in with a couple of specific answers to that question. I'll say, first of all, on the technology side, one of the big shifts that's happening in nuclear energy technology is a shift towards much smaller reactor technologies. And one of the hopes I have for this, and it's off in the future to be determined whether it comes true, is that it creates an opportunity for communities to be more engaged in the nuclear energy question. Historically, throughout my lifetime, throughout all of our lifetimes, nuclear energy has been 1,000 megawatt, large utility decision that's happening with public utility commissions and investor-owned utilities. And I think individual communities have felt and in reality have been removed from a lot of that decision-making. We look at reactor technologies that are of a similar scale to what we see in community renewable technologies going in place today. It creates an entirely different dynamic for communities to learn about and decide authentically whether they want to have that technology providing their communities energy or not, and the ability to understand at a level and say yes or no at an individual community level. It's a hope I have that technology will unleash that. We'll see whether or not it comes true as it gets deployed. Related to that then is a project I'm working on right now with colleagues at University of Oklahoma primarily, as well as Michigan and New Mexico State. And we're looking at how do you design a consent-based process where communities have authentic ability to consent to, in our case, interim use fuel storage, but I think the process can apply to lots of other technologies. And specifically, we're exploring the concept of co-design, where the very first step is to engage a community in what their values are and how they want to see those values represented in things that get deployed in their community. And then take those value statements to what I'll call the technical community that typically is involved with designing and proposing things, and encourage or require them to consider those values and then come back to the community with some options so the community can have some final say. And at the end of the day, say, no, you're not able to meet our values well enough, or say, yes, we think you have met our values and we buy into that concept. And so these, I know that this administration has a lot, certainly in the nuclear space, but I think more broadly it extends throughout the energy space, is a sort of a new commitment to figuring out how to work with communities for consent-based siting rather than what historically, the acronym I learned recently is DAD, Design, Announce, and Defend. That's the historical way that we've always done deployment of facilities, energy, and otherwise. And the idea that we engage communities earlier in that process is, I think, fundamental to being able to establish a more equitable future.
I think I just want to respond to that. And when I hear about like DAD, and even the planning and sort of research around how to effectively engage community in this co-design process, I think I get a little concerned about the timing that takes and how much time we have to, you have as a researcher to move through that process, get to community, take it back to technology and say, now go. That could be a decade, right? And I think it's important that we invest in what has happened, like all of the research and all of the work with community around all the other sectors and all the other inequities, because there are so many, and really dig into those opportunities to learn rather than start, from grade and moving forward. So where I like that idea, I think we could miss a whole lot of really, really pertinent time if we spend too much on that process.
Oh, I totally agree, and it's a conversation we're having, in various communities about how to balance the tension between this focus on doing things right in the future. If it slows us down, do we miss our opportunity to make a big impact? Versus deciding we're just going to go ahead and do it and then having a different kind of inequity, right? And so I think it's back to this sort of socio-political challenge that I identified at the beginning, is figuring out how to undo that knot, and looking to, I think what you're saying is looking to examples of success in different communities and examples of failure and how to avoid those.
And when it comes to the issue of affordability, I think we don't focus, at CUB, we don't focus as much on the siting issue, but we're trying to zero in on affordability from a much broader lens. For too often, as a state, or as utility regulators or as utilities, we were just looking at the overall average price for the one typical customer across the whole state or across our utility. But now the state is starting to collect data every year on household energy burden from all the utilities are starting to provide and that can inform new policies and new programs that can provide targeted relief for energy insecurity and energy poverty, whether that's new utility programs such as being proposed right now by Xcel Energy in western Wisconsin, bringing to Wisconsin programs they already have in Minnesota and Colorado. So we're hopeful that I mean, it's baby steps, it's early days, but we're hopeful that just the process of actually starting to measure energy burden on a granular level will get our utilities to actually looking at ways to improve that score year after year by improving energy security for the average person. And the other thing I talked about that's still needed is equity of process. We don't have until last year we hadn't had a BIPOC or a low-income intervener take part in actively in utility cases in Wisconsin. That changed last year for the very first time, and we're seeing more involvement this year too, which is a big step forward. But obviously, it's early days.
I don't know that we understand. We all work in our own sector, and we do a lot of work to advance the interests that we're passionate about. But I want to say that I don't think we understand how policy works. Who was surprised by the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act? Like, if you were a betting person, you would have never guessed it was going to happen. And it happened. We also see states like Illinois and Minnesota where you have really enabling optimistic policies. It was when a single party was in control and had the decision-making power. And there's a relationship to that and that feeling of disempowerment in decision-making and the polarization and politicization. And that goes, like, as Marquita knows, goes from community to community, too. Some communities have that same feeling of disempowerment in the decision-making process. And so I want to set up this conversation. We pretend like we run a model that says, if we did this, it would work. It would be cheaper, it'd be more jobs, and this is what it would have to look like. But then we have to ask ourselves, is that feasible to get there, and how would we get there? So I guess I'm wondering, to put a more finer point on this question, is in your job and what you do, how do you approach this coalition building? And how important is it to you? I'll put it this way. If we had the Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, right? If we could agree to disagree on some things and work towards the important things, we would be an unstoppable political force. We would have everything we wanted because we agree on so much. But we just can't seem to quite get out of our bubble and build coalitions. So I guess I'm asking you in your work, how do you see coalition building, and what are some of the things that you think we should be doing more of, or that you could be doing more of?
So I run a trade association. It's not a huge association, but we have a lot of members from very different sectors. So I work with utility companies, automakers, EV charging station companies, some folks in the propane industry, some folks in the biofuels industry. And so there's, let's say, 40 people around the table that all have their own very specific business interests in what we call the Big Tent of clean transportation. My job, really, as the leader of the association, is to figure out what are the things that we can agree on, what are the things that folks can compromise on, and how do we make progress as a group. And sometimes what I get out of the industry folks is at odds with what I get out of the table when I'm sitting with my fellow environmentalists and nonprofit leaders. And so this is a lot of my job, is balancing that nuance, balancing those different interests. And I do feel very passionately, I talked about this in my Rise Up Live talk on Friday, that we have to value progress over perfection. If we can get people around a table and agree on what's the next step, or maybe what's the series of next steps, we're going to make so much more progress than if we try to hash out what's the vision in 2050, right? We have to make incremental progress, and I talked to Chelsea about this after her talk too, which I found so interesting about ethanol and solar and how do we prioritize what we use our land for. And, I think in a similar way that nuclear is, somewhat contentious in the renewable energy industry, biofuels are very contentious in the clean transportation industry. And so some of the policies I work on, I don't see eye to eye with some of my environmental colleagues because they just have a hard line on biofuels. And I wish Chelsea were here and we could have some of that conversation for the podcast. But I think, again, Chelsea and I sit next to each other. And we can lock arms on most things, right, and move in the same direction. And so I think it's coming to that agreement that, we're all generally moving in the same direction. And so if we can speed walk instead of walk and argue, we're going to get a lot further.
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on that a little bit, I mean, we have to start the conversations. Some of them may be awkward at first and tough, because of the talking points we use in public forums and such. And we've dug ourselves into political trenches. We've got to come out of those trenches and have initially tough conversations and later good conversations, even if we have differences about visions for other parts of society, trying to have shared experience to some extent in the clean energy transition. I remember just listening to a story a while back on NPR, and the gentleman who was speaking was talking about Americans aren't good at nuance. We see everything in black and white, and we got to get good at nuance. We got to get good at talking with each other again. It's been, across society the last couple of decades, we've all become entrenched, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. I don't know what the solution is, but we gotta pull each other out of those trenches and start talking to each other.
I work for the health department, and I think the way we viewed supporting and building coalition is to rely on community as expert and to take on the risk that community would otherwise have to absorb. And I think the other thing we have to remember is when we're building coalition, we have to remember that when folks, black and brown folks, come to the table, they don't have the privilege of just talking about clean energy and the environment. So they come having to leave some things right at the door that they got to pick up when they leave. And so when I say we take on or absorb some of that risk, we've like inorganically decided, we'll join Jamez at the RATC. We'll provide that funding. We'll experimentally take on a training opportunity and see how this works. And if it fails, it's on us, right? For us, it's leaning into community as expert, recognizing that there's some pieces and there's a whole lot at work there and some pieces that they have to leave at the door that they're picking up when they leave, and that we got to hold space for whatever it is they bring and can contribute.
This might be a little pessimistic, but I think a lot of folks talked about the importance of making sure you really build a broad tent and bring in a lot of different folks. I think that's really important. It has a lot of power. I think sometimes you have to be careful, though, that you aren't straying too far from your principles just to include, maybe make friends with industry or utility partners that just really actually aren't willing to play game and aren't really committed to the same things that maybe community groups are committed to or nonprofit organizations are committed to. So I think you need to be careful that you are, if folks are willing to come with you and they agree to your principles, great, let's build that big tent, but you can't, there's always the risk of watering things down to a point where it's not actually what you were hoping for or what you think is actually going to be successful or effective or what your community needs. So there's some balance though too.
I would absolutely agree with that. And I think when you try to include everybody, and the moment something arises that a particular body doesn't agree with, and they're like, exit door left, you lose trust, right? That trust in community is lost.
So it's funny you mentioned that, Katie, because when I listened to your podcast episode, this is one of the thoughts I definitely had. When you talk about distributed renewable energy resources, that appeals to a lot of different parts of the spectrum. And the thing that happily you kept coming back to, which I think is this grounding principle that centers that, is this justice question, right? Because there's different sub-communities for whom distributed renewable energy appeals to them for their own personal benefit and not for the redistributive benefit that comes with justice. And so, I think, centering that kind of thing as we see this administration doing federally, and hopefully we can see more of it happening to really create this. Jane talked about hard lines. We want to make sure we are hard line about the right things. right? Not hardline about, things that maybe are preventing our ability to form coalitions, but remaining hardline about the things that really are fundamental to see move forward in the transition.
So I'm going to expose a little of the design principle here of kind of the podcast season. I think that the advice, the career advice that our nation is now giving is build off your strengths, right? I think that's a really good piece of advice in a complex society that's very dynamic, where we get to see firsthand everybody's strengths. And, we have these like confidence issues in youth because they're connected to all of the riches and things that everybody else has, right? So the idea of building off your strengths, I would also say kind of like staying in our lane. It's hard. There's a lot of work to do. It's really complicated. So like this panel, for example, the reason you're all up here is because you all have very specific strengths in the energy transition. Andrew, pedantic, holistic policy view. It's important. Someone's got to be looking at all the parts and figuring out how they're going to get together. Tom and Cub, a hard-nosed approach at equity under this affordability and best decision-making lens. Like that is so critically important in this kind of public process that is utility rate making. Somebody that really cares about future costs and how they're delivered and how we make decisions at the best possible way so that we don't burden the future generations with our current decisions. That's your bread and butter. Jane, the entire bringing in this calcified, capital-intensive transportation industry and the electric industry, like building those coalitions, that's the difficult thing you do. Paul, engineering. Like, regardless of what people think about nuclear, it still provides a bulk of our power. We are the biggest nuclear producing country. It's every time we close a nuclear plant, carbon emissions go up all across the world. So this idea of the engineering principle, it heartens me to hear you talk about public engagement and public process, because that industry has probably been the least open to the public process. And so, Katie, energy democracy, this idea of the social principle of access and ownership as a formative principle to how we deploy the next. There's two solutions in one there: bringing energy more local, which is being more efficient, and increasing participation and acceptance. All comes with this energy democracy. And you, Marquita, this hard, difficult social process of lifting people that need lifting and bringing them into the access. Like you said, I am here to take some of the risk out of this proposition. That takes a lot of heart, a lot of will, a lot of leaning. And so, booting up my question, what are you leaning into? What is your lane? We're looking for the next 10 years. Like, how are you contributing? I'm not asking you to make a commitment here. But like, when you see yourself putting your effort in this transition, if you truly believe it, where's your effort going? What do you think is most important for us to work on? Thinking of your organization and your role.
So I think it's all about putting people first and making this kind of bumpy ride in the transition a little more smooth. We've got this steel for fuel strategy of moving away from investing in. We're investing in the steel of new solar to replace the fossil fuel and the fuel costs. But right now, we're still paying the fuel costs. And if the utilities have their way, they're still going to be profiting from the coal plants long after they shut down. So we're leaning into changing the way utility profits are set so that they're incentivized to do things to do right by customers. It's the technical term is, the wonky term is performance-based regulation, but it's really a way of resetting how the utilities earn their profits so that they're earning profits not just for build, but for doing things that people care about, like efficiency, like, of course, reliability, but efficiency, DG, customer responsiveness, and affordability. And as part of that, we're leaning into affordability for everybody along the way.
Thanks, Tom. I'll kind of, again, echo some of those sentiments. And from Renew Wisconsin's perspective, we had that model done, study written, kind of showing a snapshot of 2050. But I kind of equate that as, if you all have watched the Avengers movies, Thanos snaps his finger and makes it happen, right? It's not going to happen unless we make it happen together. So kind of reverse engineering to the present moment, what steps do we need to get there in the future? we see roadblocks at every single level of clean energy development and clean energy access. And so how do we simultaneously address all those roadblocks? How do we prioritize the ones that are most important? And, obviously at the utility scale, there's a lot of folks who feel left out and it's somewhat near their backyard, and their initial knee-jerk reaction is to try to block, prohibit, or slow down that project. At the distribution level, it maybe doesn't fit in the utilities' initial plans because of their business case, right? And their fiduciary duty to generate revenues for their shareholders. And where we're trying to create, jobs where the market's yet not formed there. We've got to start at the grassroots level and create the public-private partnerships at statewide level, community levels throughout the state, throughout the Midwest region, nation, global, obviously. So how do we address all those issues at once? It's going to be the process we go through before the Public Service Commission, the legislature, the different state agencies, working with y'all in your different organizations and you as individuals is going to be very, very important. And ultimately, we're going to have to prioritize some of these roadblocks and address them in innovative ways to remove them and make sure an equitable transition happens and we get to that future by 2050 where we have all clean energy.
So I would say, first I'll speak sort of for the College of Engineering at UW. We're leaning into working with communities and understanding how community interests can help drive our research priorities. And this is beyond nuclear. So this is storage and EVs and microgrids and all those sort of questions. We've had this history of us pursuing our academic interests and wonderful things come from those, but it doesn't necessarily meet the immediate needs of communities. And so we have a new effort underway to reach out and work with individual communities, and we've done some work with tribal communities in Wisconsin and others to help inform our research directions and our research interests by what communities are pursuing and what they're interested in and gain a dialogue from that. More specifically and more personally, I'm leaning into finding a way to have a different societal relationship for nuclear energy, to move it to something where communities have a much more, as I alluded, I won't repeat myself, but communities have a stronger role in being able to request or resist the use of nuclear energy in their communities and how that fits across the nuclear fuel cycle.
I really believe in the power of business to do good in the world when that business is pointed in the right direction. And so I'm really passionate about my role now because I get to work with industry and I get to work with my nonprofit friends and figure out how do we connect the dots to move everyone's interests forward. And so, Clean Fuels Michigan, I think that's what we do. That's how we find our priorities, is where's that Venn diagram between community, nonprofit, environmental, and business goals. And I see that's where I'll spend my career because I feel like that's where you get to have these juicy conversations and figure out how do we use the power of profits to accelerate all the impacts that we want to see for other community and environmental goals.
For ILSR, which is the organization that I work with, one thing we're really focused on across our organization, but also in our energy democracy initiative. This is pretty related, actually, to the comment about performance-based regulation, but just making sure that utilities are held accountable for actually building energy that benefits communities, benefits their customers, and not just their shareholders. So this can be a lot of different things. 3 states recently passed utility accountability legislation that does things like preventing utilities from charging their captive customers for their lobbying activities. So all those things like that are really, I think, something we have always and we will continue to lean in on because it's really important that, again, as we're transitioning to clean energy, that we aren't just replicating systems today that are not serving people well, but that we're actually transitioning to something better and greater.
As a health department, our lane will continue to be to find resources to support reduction of inequities in Minneapolis and leaning into training people up for these opportunities, and then also continuing on our encroachment of other folks' business in Minneapolis. And we want to, continue to encourage Public Works, our business CPED team to support business ownership, to support young people working in green infrastructure development in the city. And so the health department has really done really good about not being in our lane, and I think we should continue that, to blur those lines.
Yeah, to put a point on Marquita's conversation, one thing that I really appreciated about learning about what you do is that the health department in Minneapolis kind of enabled you to follow the passion projects. Like they trusted you to come to the table and bring something together, and that's you found a space for that in the city. And I kind of want to sum up with that from my perspective here. I came here as a volunteer, looking for a place to land with good people. And I think where our passion is at the MRE and my passion is having faith in people and giving them a way to like find what their lane is and is their passion. And I think your program's a good example of that, putting faith in people to, our problem at the MRE and as many in this industry isn't like motivating employees to work, it's to keep them from burning out because they're so passionate about what they do. And so that idea of trusting people, helping them find their passion, helping them join our movement. A really smart person once told me that everything we want's inside here, and there's multiple ways to get in there. And all we have to do is get everybody started where they're at, and then bring them in here with us. And so I want to thank you all. Today we're going to ask some questions. So if anybody from the audience has a question, yes, sir. The question is kind of like this pressure we feel from climate change and how it relates to this kind of like incremental steps that we're all trying to take. I guess I'll start. Maybe it's because I'm going insane. Sometimes I feel like I'm going insane, but sometimes I feel like the climate crisis is my own individual crisis. Like it's a reflection of our emotional crisis, and that for example, if you want to have a loving relationship with somebody, you have to care for them, meet for them where they are, be tolerant, be honest with them, expose yourself with them, share, trust them. If you want to have a work partnership with somebody, all the same things apply. If you want to build a coalition, all the same things apply. If you want to build a movement, all the same things apply. And so I feel like if we want to respond to a true crisis, we have to build our own stability. We have to build stability with our compatriots, with our family, with our community. And that's what I hear up here from everybody. And that's as much as we can do. And I view the world in a very simple framework. There's destructive tension or there's creative tension. Destructive tension is when you want to see the world in a certain way and your daily actions don't get you there. That's the addiction crisis. That we have that crisis. Creative tension is understanding that it's going to be really hard to get there, that it might be far away, but every day you're moving towards that, and that's motivation. And holding that tension, that creative tension, would be my response to that question. We can't let ourselves get demoralized. That's the number one thing. Crisis is an opportunity. And so I don't think that anybody up on this panel is ignoring that crisis. I think what we're talking about is how do we day to day exert ourselves in a way that gets us to a solution there, whether it's possible or not.
Well, I just bring up the economic power of the Inflation Reduction Act. So the fact is, it passed. I mean, the fact is, it is the biggest step that Congress has ever taken in this regard. It's more of it's all about incentives rather than command and control and mandates from on high. But the incentives are powerful. If you think about the add-ons to the tax credits and the utilities themselves are looking at that and redrafting all their resource planning based on that because of the powerful economic incentives with the tax credits there. It's all about risks, opportunities, but it's also about risks. So the negative thing I'd bring up, it would be that the utility system itself isn't built, or it doesn't plan for, hasn't been able to plan for extreme weather. When you site a power line, a power plant, or anything, it's all based on standards that were of how you would expect the last 30 years to be replicated in the next 30 years. And as more extreme events happen, the modeling that the utilities have are using to basically plan for the infrastructure of tomorrow needs to evolve and evolve quickly.
I'll just very quickly, as you're getting the mic, I'll just say that I think there is this tension. There's this tension between the pace at which we need to see an energy transition. There's a tension with the resilience that we needed to have once we've made that transition, and there's a tension with the equity and justice that we expect in today's world to have with that transition. And those things, finding that I mean, I think what Nick's getting at is using that tension creatively to find the solutions that will help us address them all is the challenge. And we can get caught up in each one of those tensions by itself and get lost. And so we really need to find a way to hold those tensions at balance and move forward creatively.
Read an article a while ago that said some of the leaders for climate change initiatives are happening more at local government levels in cities than necessarily statewide. And I was wondering if some of you have run into that, and if in Wisconsin that might be good, considering there could be policy changes over the next decade or so to concentrate somewhat more on citywide initiatives that might be more stable, where we seem to have long-term mayors and city people.
I guess I can start. I know that there's a Wisconsin Local Government Climate Coalition, and we've seen them now form and start to participate in some of the rate cases and represent their local government's clean energy goals and their ability and liberty to create economic development utilizing clean energy businesses and technologies in their communities as well. So I think that is true. That is starting out in local communities, suburban, rural areas in particular. They have to deal with blue and red politics, and they have to have a vision for their local community and say, hey, we need to adapt to this future and make sure that we have an economic future in clean energy. And to the extent that that's not aligned with statewide goals and policies, we need to start getting involved and make sure that they know that we have these goals and that their state policies are impacting those goals so that we can have some not only awareness but influence ultimately in state policies that are impacting local communities.
I'll just add that in some ways, communities are victims to state policy and energy. We are the state is almost primal. The federal government can issue rules and market incentives that certain states respond to, but the local organizing around clean energy can increase market transparency, make the market better, increase consumer engagement, decrease red tape, build coalitions to inform state policy, and that's kind of what you're seeing from the city side, is this idea of organizing. Like every state has, and even like the Minneapolis, they have organizations of jurisdictions that lobby and that pressure state policy. So just to build on what Andrew's saying, some of it is a response to cities not having their needs met and not feeling like the state legislatures are taking them seriously. And other cities organize in response to real opportunities. And this is the framework, okay? The federal government, starting with the housing crisis and the financial response to that at the end of the George W. Bush administration, they started inventing money. Quantitative easing, modern monetary theory, whatever you call it. That accelerated during COVID, and we did two things. We invented money from the Fed, and we printed debt from the federal government. And all of that is invented. And it's all coming to communities, and has been, and will. And here's the framework. This might be the last time this ever happens, so you better take this money and invest it wisely in durable solutions that have very strong values and build wealth locally. And those communities that are organizing this way are best set to do that. So regardless of the past, I feel like the present is one in which we need to spend this money that we invented wisely so that not only can we recover the debts that it caused and the inflation that it causes, but that we can be prepared for the next time a catastrophe dries up, childcare or manufacturing or whatever. And so I think that those local initiatives are critically important in the United States at this moment.
So I guess my question is how can we make the coalitions between at least the southeastern cities and the Madison Madison and the more rural-based liberal communities more cohesive?
Renew there's a recent coalition that has started, which Renew is part of. It's called the Wisconsin Clean Energy Economy Coalition. And the launch of that was last spring in Milwaukee. And we want to bring together statewide organizations and local businesses, but local organizations that are looking at, Milwaukee and communities, southeastern Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin communities as well, and looking at their particular energy burden, environmental justice issues, so that we're able to share each other's experiences and collaborate on not only statewide policies and issues, but local issues as well. So it's happening. It's kind of starting up, and I'll be happy to talk with you a little bit more on the side and get your ideas as well.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you all for tolerating me throughout these last months, responding to my invites, coming together. I hope you guys have built some relationships and that we can keep this conversation going. It's been my honor and pleasure, so thank you so much.
Special thanks to all of our Rise Up Live panel participants: Marquita Keys, Katie Keenbaum, Paul Wilson, Jane McCurry, Tom Content, and Andrew Kell, hosted by Nick Hyla and produced by Kyle Galloway.